Anna Wierzbicka. We're here in Australian National University. My name is James Underhill. I'm from the Rouen Ethnolinguistics project in France. You argue here, I'd like to move on to a little bit how we live in languages, because you published an interesting book on living in languages and translating lives about 10 years ago now, 2006 I believe.
2007 I
think,
yeah.
2007. You argued that learning other languages and how they work and breaking out of Anglo modes of thinking and feeling can help you broaden the vision of your emotional lives. Can you expand on that? It seems to be we're moving beyond the confines of English.
Yes, well, this book, which was edited jointly with my daughter Mary Besmers, was not so much about learning languages as living in different languages and translating your life from one language into another, which is a very common experience, of course, these days, people living in two different languages. And there's a lot of literature on this, autobiographical literature, as well as there are novels written by people who live in two different languages. So we know that people's lives really are different depending on the language they are living them with. What was your specific question? Sorry, James.
Can you expand on that question?
Can I expand?
But let me be more precise.
Okay.
See here, what's interesting here is we're moving beyond this idea of the monolingual world into the idea that as most cultures and most times we're multilingual, and there are various languages in any army or any company most times. This idea of this monolingual myth that the Anglo culture or the French culture, perhaps or the German culture has, that we must have one language and we must abandon another language in order to be part of the new culture, something you haven't really done that. What I'm interested in is how this reflection on your own life and your own way of living in languages has nourished your research, but also how you're negotiating the different words and concepts at a linguistic level and at a personal level. Let's talk about the word drug. Drug in Russian, which means friend, but druzhba, friendship, drug, has very different meanings at different times, and you argue that this is a fundamental difference. You've discussed how those differences can be seen in between ami in French, in friend in English. How would you negotiate that?
Yeah, well, I haven't actually looked closely at ami, but it's clear that different languages categorize human relations in different ways, which are these differences are culturally very significant. And this is a very good example of drug and przyjaciel in Polish and friend in English. Well, actually, there's also a historical perspective, because the meaning of the English word friends changed a lot. Friends, for Shakespeare, friends was not the same thing as it is now. As I think I tried to document too in this book, understanding languages through their keywords. Starting with the question of how many friends you can have, and it used to be that you, in English, for English speakers, you only had very few friends, but now you can make friends.
Yes.
Make friends, very characteristic expression, and you have a broad circle of friends and so on, which indicates changes, which is linked with changes in the meaning. So what does friend mean in English? Essentially, your friends are people that you like to often be with and maybe do things with. That's one sort of key part, I think, of friend. But it's not like this. For example, the Polish przyjaciel doesn't really have this emphasis on being with and doing things with, but much more, and you want this person to know what you think, and what you want this person to know what you feel, which is not necessarily part of the English friend at all. And it seems to me the Russian drug, as I try to show too, there's huge emphasis on what good things that you do for this person. So if somebody is your drug and they want you to do something good for them, well, you can't not do it, essentially. I think this aspect...
So there's a kind of duty involved?
Well, I wouldn't use the word duty, because that's an Anglo concept. Again, it's just use primes, because it's the primes which allow you to identify, pinpoint the differences. So if this person wants you to do good, says, I want you to do some good things for me, I can't not do it. That would be the key Russian component here. I want to know what this person thinks. I'm still simplifying, but essentially you can only get to these subtle differences using words like do and sing and be with and do good things with, and not abstract nouns taken from English.
Okay, I think we're getting to the heart of the problem, because it is true that sometimes your approach has been criticised for essentialising or reducing things. It seems to me there's a misconception, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're not denying that there are numerous synonyms, and these synonyms are changing over time. For example, the example that comes to mind for me personally is družba is a word that I would have learned in Czech, but I've learned it in Czech in 1990, and there would be bars called družba in the Czech areas where there were Russian soldiers occupying, and this was supposed to show the friendship between the Russians and the Czechs. Of course, the Czechs were very ironic of this, and when I said I was in the bar družba, they said they knew what I was talking about when I talked about I was in the bar Eduard, because they changed the name from družba to Eduard after the revolution. These things. So you're not denying that these things are complex, full of synonyms, and that the synonyms interact together in complex ways. You're simply trying to get to the essential meanings of the keywords. Is that
no, but a word can have several different meanings and be used in several different ways, and we can pinpoint these different meanings. That's the thing, you know. We can show what the differences are and similarities.
Okay, that's interesting.
But as far as the essentializing cultures, I've been thinking about it. You know, as I look at my book, Cross-Cultural Pragmatics, 1991, I do see the sections like French culture, this, black culture, this, white culture, this. And I wouldn't speak like this today because I know how sensitive people are. I realized at that time too that there wasn't anything like French culture, Russian culture. But I didn't pay enough attention to saying what I'm talking about is certain specific cultural norms which are reflected in linguistic facts. So this is, I think that criticism was probably justified. The way of talking about it using these very easily expressions like Russian culture, I would avoid it.
I think that what our friend Jerzy Bartminski would do, he would simply say that there is a Polish norm for this word, that all Polish people must know, that there will be people on the right, the left, etc., various different, but from this we can generate not an ideal, but a sort of synthetic whole that people can argue over. Once we have the concept, we can argue about it, but we're arguing about where the definition, the boundaries are, for example.
But I just find now that this term of cultural scripts is far more useful than just talking about culture in a general sense. There are Russian cultural scripts. I'm very comfortable with this, which I discuss in various papers, and you can support this with linguistic evidence without trying to generalize about Russian culture as such, which is risky.
So would there be a cultural script in relation to ojczyzna, into the homeland in Polish, for example, that Polish people
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. That I have to think about.
So it's probably
but there are lots of other cultural scripts,
you claim that, we've already spoken about this and some of the other things, but some of the key concepts that English people are thinking about in terms of moral speech, and this takes us beyond, or takes most people beyond the conceptual level. This is the level at which they have difficulty thinking because they're thinking at a gut level. Fairness, right and wrong are Anglo concepts with Anglo values. This is quite important for your approach, that words are value loaded or caught up in cultural scripts, which people are not really, don't tend to want to recognize. Is that because we don't like to see, or we can't see the limits of our language?
Yeah, because it is at the gut level, as you say. People don't think about it, and they imagine that everybody thinks like this.
Okay, then. So would that mean that you would agree with Wittgenstein when he says the limits of my language define the limits of my thought? Do you believe that?
Yeah, well, it's a very fine saying, but who knows what he meant by it, you know? He never really explained.
All of the keywords, die bedeuten meiner Sprache, die Grenzen.
I remember the quote, you know, but was he talking about German as different from English? That's really not clear. I don't think he was. I don't think he was talking about particular languages, whereas we as linguists are more interested in languages. So English, in contrast to French or Polish, does place certain boundaries on how you habitually think. You can, of course, go beyond those boundaries, but habitual thinking is strongly influenced by the vocabulary of your native language. But you know, whether this is what Wittgenstein had in mind, I'm not sure, and I don't think anybody really knows.
Okay, well, he's an early work of his as well. That's not from his philosophical reflections. But can we do without fairness, right and wrong, these Anglo concepts? How would you...
What do you mean? I've lived all my life without fairness and without right and wrong. But that was actually one of the greatest battles with my daughters when they were growing up. They constantly would say, well, frequently, that they're bilingual, but a concept like fair was essential to them. So that's not fair. And I would just say, look, I don't think in those terms. It's not my concept. I don't want to be fair. And so that was a constant, clash.
So Mama's not fair. This would be a fair...
Yeah. And why should I be fair? That's not. I don't think in such terms.
The difficulty I have with my daughters was since they're taught within the French system and very early with the droit de l'homme, they would say j'ai le droit de. I have the right to. Which I can imagine discussing with a 14, 15-year-old intellectual adolescent. But no English child will talk in terms of I have the right to.
Very interesting.
I have, as a child, children have rights, and we know our rights, and now we want chocolate. We're moving very, very, very interesting these days. So your work, would it be fair to say that your work as a linguist has developed alongside your bilingual existence? Is this a daily reflection on the apprehension of concepts that are strange to you that need to be explained?
Yes, yeah. Well, I started with research into semantic universals. In 1972, I published this book, Semantic Primes, and I was really mostly interested in universal human concepts. But since we came here to Australia to live in 73, and I started living in those two languages, it of course became somehow terribly important and vital to find my way between these two languages. And it was an overwhelming impression that these are sort of different conceptual systems. So that became a topic for investigation. I was investigating my own life and the lives in our bilingual family and cross-cultural family too.
So translating lives is really a sort of key experience for you?
Absolutely.
Is this true that this happens? There are a lot of linguists who have this background. Sapir and Worf and Boas are known as the three key linguists in the American tradition, but two of them are Jewish Germans. I think Boas comes when he's 28 to the States, but he speaks about my language, and he's speaking about it as English in a very sort of adopting English as the new language of the American culture. Sapir, he comes when he's 5, but he seems to have always this sort of Hebrew tradition in the background, and this is the world views are fairly flexible from that point of view. Worf takes a different attitude. He's very much an American in some, and he sees languages as foreign languages as exotic things that we can get into, we can penetrate, or we can move into a different frontier. Those are very different from your experience, I would say, of living in languages as a multilingual.
I suppose so. I mean, there are obviously points in common.
Do you still consider yourself Polish? After 30, 40 years?
Of course, okay. What a question,
So, could you define Polish for us in NSM? Not someone who lives in Poland, for example.
I don't know.
What about other Poles? Do you think other Poles find, I find personally, after 25 years of living in France, that people in Britain will see the French that's interfering with my English, and my English is a little dated. So the slang, the expressions, and even my knowledge of politics, jokes, the sense of humour is difficult. Do you think other Poles perceive you as an expatriate or as...
I don't think so. I mean, just a few years ago I got this award for Polish Science Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences, being recognized as a scholar in Polish Humanities and Social Sciences.
And that's important for you?
Very important for me. It's very important for me, of course, yeah.
So it's interesting just to close our discussions together to understand that your position as a bilingual is not one of rejecting one life and one language in order to adopt another life and another language. Is that a monolingual fantasy or a monolingual moral constraint that really has no meaning for you and me as bilingual Europeans or Australians? Is that...
I don't know. I obviously live in those two traditions, and they somehow are mixed and perhaps to some extent integrated, and it's a constant daily negotiation. Every day I write in the morning well, something like what to do list, and should I write it in Polish or in English? And I feel it's a big sort of moral struggle, in a sense, you know. I pray in Polish mainly, for example. But
so your relationship with God would be a relationship in Polish.
Absolutely, yeah. But when I write about semantics, often it is easier, or talk about it, sometimes it's easier, well, often it's easier in English. And when I try to write the same paper in English and in Polish, as I sometimes do, it comes out very, very different. It's impossible to say the same things and to talk in the same way in Polish and in English. But both these personas are somehow very important to me.
And part of the same persona.
Well, sort of.
Yeah. Anna Wierzbicka, thank you very much for being so open and giving us such great, clear and precise answers, which is not always the case when you ask a linguist. Thank you for your very precise.
James.
Okay, these discussions will be continuing with our research assistants. So thank you.
Thank you, James.
Great.